The chamber was thick with silence, the kind that presses against the skin and sharpens every sound. All eyes turned as Brett Kavanaugh leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. He adjusted his glasses, pretending patience, before letting out a low chuckle that rolled across the room, like an insult disguised as amusement. It wasn't just a laugh, it was a dismissal, the sound of someone who thought the outcome was already written in his favor. His words had barely formed into a question, one crafted to corner, to belittle. When the laugh broke through, it carried arrogance, a mocking tone that said, "You don't belong here. You're not on my level." Senators shifted uncomfortably, aides glanced at one another, and the faint echo of that laugh lingered like static in the air. For a split second, it seemed as if the power of the bench had dwarfed the presence of the congresswoman across from him. But then Jasmine Crockett leaned forward. No hesitation, no stumble. Her eyes locked on his, steady, unflinching, the kind of gaze that can cut through the pretense of authority and expose its fragility. And then, with a voice that sliced through the chamber sharper than any gavel strike, she delivered it, a one-liner so blistering it froze the room in an instant. "You can laugh all you want, Judge, but it won't make your record any less shameful." The air snapped. Gasps fluttered like sparks. For a moment, even the lights above seemed brighter, as though the truth itself had cracked through the ceiling. Kavanaugh's smirk faltered, his chuckle choked back into silence. The weight of her words hung in the chamber, undeniable and heavy. Staffers stared wide-eyed, unsure whether to look at her or at him. Some senators leaned back, hiding grins behind their hands. Others stiffened, sensing a tide they could no longer control. In that instant, power shifted. The room no longer belonged to the judge who laughed. It belonged to the woman who dared to confront him, without flinching, without apology. The silence that followed was louder than the laugh had ever been. The confrontation had only just begun, and that was only the beginning. The hearing was never meant to be routine. From the moment it was scheduled, the nation knew what was at stake. This was not just a clash of personalities. It was a reckoning, a test of whether truth and dignity could still stand firm against arrogance and entitlement in one of the highest chambers of American power. The issue at the center was bigger than the technicalities of law. It touched the very fabric of justice, women's rights, and the public's fragile trust in its institutions. Every word spoken in that chamber would ripple outward, through headlines into living rooms, across timelines into conversations at dinner tables and protests on the streets. For many watching, it was not about parliamentary procedure. It was about identity, representation, and the question of whether voices like Jasmine Crockett's could ever truly stand equal in halls, so often dominated by men who laughed at them. Kavanaugh knew the stakes too. His strategy was clear from the outset: diminish, dismiss, and destabilize. He leaned on the oldest tactics in the book: condescension disguised as questioning, a mocking laugh to imply superiority, subtle digs meant to paint Crockett as unprepared, unworthy, or simply too emotional. It was a performance designed to undermine, to make the audience forget her record, her resolve, and instead focus on his staged calm. He wanted to script the narrative, a seasoned judge putting a younger lawmaker in her place. But beneath the smugness, there was calculation. He understood that if Crockett came out of this exchange standing tall, it would not just bruise his pride. It would pierce the larger armor of authority he carried into every public moment. And that was something he could not afford. For Crockett, the pressure was heavier still. One misstep, a slip of the tongue, a misplaced tone, even a flash of visible anger, could be weaponized against her, amplified beyond the chamber and twisted into proof that she wasn't ready for the spotlight. Her opponents were waiting for it. Her critics were hoping for it. The cameras were hungry for it. And yet she did not flinch, because Crockett knew this was more than a hearing. This was a trial of respect, a test of whether dignity could outlast derision. To her supporters, women, immigrants, everyday Americans who felt the sting of being underestimated, she carried their voice. If she faltered, they faltered with her. But if she stood strong, the victory would be shared far beyond those marble walls. The room itself reflected that tension. Every chuckle, every word, every sharp inhale from the crowd carried the weight of a nation split between those who believed power belonged to the few and those who believed it should serve the many. Senators whispered behind hands. Reporters tapped furiously at keyboards, knowing they were capturing history in real time. Kavanaugh's laugh had been the spark, but the firestorm was only beginning to build. Crockett, steady and deliberate, had already signaled that she would not play by his script. And as the hearing pressed forward, the stakes only grew clearer. This was not just about policy, not just about credibility, but about the soul of the debate itself. One misstep could define her career, but one well-aimed strike could define his downfall. The question lingered in the air, electric and unspoken. Who would emerge unshaken when the dust settled? What came next would leave no doubt. Brett Kavanaugh did not stumble into power. He was groomed for it, born into comfort, educated at the nation's most elite institutions, and shepherded through the corridors of privilege. His ascent was marked less by struggle than by inevitability. His resume gleamed: Yale, the Federalist Society, clerking for conservative icons. To those who valued Polish and pedigree above all else, Kavanaugh was a dream candidate, articulate, disciplined, and trained to wear authority like a tailored suit. But beneath the veneer of polish lay a man whose career was marred by contradictions. He styled himself as a guardian of law and order, yet his own record was riddled with moments that shook public trust. The confirmation hearings years earlier had etched themselves into the collective memory. The fiery denials, the visible anger, the accusations that hung like a shadow he could never fully outrun. His defenders painted him as the victim of a smear campaign, while his critics saw a man whose privilege insulated him from accountability. For Kavanaugh, survival in those moments was not about truth, but about control. He leaned on his connections, the political machinery at his back, and the inertia of a system designed to protect its own. Each controversy became just another hurdle cleared, another scar he wore as proof of his endurance. In time, he embraced the role of survivor, framing himself as the wronged judge who had weathered storms and emerged untouchable. Yet the cracks were always there. Behind closed doors, colleagues described his temper, his sharp edges, the arrogance that bled into conversations. Publicly, his judicial opinions often revealed a deference to power, a willingness to side with corporations and entrenched interests over individuals struggling for a fair shot. He spoke the language of the Constitution, but many felt he wielded it selectively, shaping justice to suit ideology. And when challenged, Kavanaugh often resorted to the same tactics he displayed in that chamber: laugh, belittle, dismiss, project superiority. His smile carried a sneer, his laugh a warning. To him, debate was not an exchange of ideas, but a performance of dominance. Those beneath him were to be reminded of their place. Those beside him were to be outshined. Those who dared oppose him, they were to be humiliated. This was the playbook he had leaned on for decades. In the judiciary, where deference to robes and titles often silenced dissent, it had worked. In politics, where backroom deals and party loyalty could erase scandal, it had worked. Time and again, Kavanaugh had faced storms that might have sunk another man, and each time he emerged, scarred but standing. The message was clear. He was untouchable. But untouchable is not the same as unbreakable. His past was littered with reminders of fragility. The women who testified against him, whose voices were drowned out by the machinery of confirmation, never truly disappeared from the narrative. The images of his red-faced outbursts at the Senate hearing remained etched into the national consciousness, symbols of entitlement cracking under pressure. For millions of Americans, those hearings were not an exoneration, but a cautionary tale. That power, when unchecked, corrodes justice itself. Still, Kavanaugh carried on as though absolved, as though history had already vindicated him. His rulings on the bench, his carefully staged public appearances, his calculated attempts at humor, all were efforts to reframe himself as steady, as legitimate, as above reproach. And yet in moments like this Senate hearing with Jasmine Crockett, the mask slipped. The mocking laugh, the condescension, they revealed the same old habits of privilege and arrogance. What he underestimated was that times had changed. The country was less willing to swallow arrogance as confidence, less willing to excuse privilege as merit. The very audiences that once deferred unquestioningly to men like him were beginning to shift their gaze. They were watching closely, hungry for authenticity, for voices unafraid to puncture the old myths of authority. Kavanaugh entered that chamber believing he was stepping into familiar territory, a chance to flex, to belittle, to remind a rising star of her place. He believed his old playbook would carry him once again, as it always had. He believed that his Polish and pedigree would shield him from consequence, that his laugh would echo louder than her words. But what he didn't see, what he couldn't see, was that Jasmine Crockett was not like the opponents he had faced before. She carried no reverence for his robes, no fear of his privilege, no hesitation to pierce the facade. She had been underestimated all her life, and every time she had turned underestimation into strength. For Brett Kavanaugh, the chamber felt familiar. For Jasmine Crockett, it was the stage she had prepared for all along. And when the clash came, his laugh would not save him. His old playbook was about to collapse. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin in the gilded halls of power, nor does it rest on a foundation of privilege. It begins in the neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce, where resilience had to be cultivated like oxygen, and where every achievement was carved from struggle. From an early age, she understood what it meant to be overlooked, to be underestimated, to be told that certain doors were not meant to open for her. But she also understood something more powerful, that she could never accept those limits as permanent. Her upbringing was shaped by a deep sense of responsibility. Family was not just blood but community. Neighbors who looked out for one another, mentors who extended a hand, elders who instilled values of dignity and self-respect. She was raised with the belief that justice was not an abstract idea, reserved for textbooks or courtrooms, but a living principle that demanded defense in everyday life. When a friend was treated unfairly, Jasmine spoke up. When classmates were dismissed or silenced, she made sure their voices were heard. These early sparks foreshadowed the fire that would define her career. Education became her escape hatch and her weapon. While others doubted her potential, she pushed herself with relentless determination. In law school, she was never content to simply pass exams or memorize case law. She wanted to understand how the system worked, and more importantly, how it failed people who looked like her, people who had been told they didn't belong. For Jasmine, studying law was not about prestige. It was about preparing herself for a fight that had started long before she was born. The fight for equality, for representation, for dignity. When her peers chased clerkships in ivory towers, Jasmine walked a different path. She threw herself into grassroots activism, working cases that didn't promise wealth or fame, but demanded courage. She defended the overlooked and the marginalized, often for little more than gratitude and the knowledge that she had made a difference. Immigrants, single mothers, struggling workers. These were her clients, her people, her cause. Every case became personal, every courtroom a battlefield where she stood as a shield against a system too often rigged against them. Her immigrant-inclusive values weren't rhetorical talking points. They were lived. She saw in the immigrant struggle the same resilience she had inherited from her own upbringing. Families sacrificing everything to give their children a shot. Workers enduring indignity to carve out stability. Voices silenced because of accents, skin color, or unfamiliar names. To Jasmine, defending immigrants was not charity. It was justice. It was recognition that America's story was never written by one people but by many, layered together through struggle and perseverance. Her activism caught attention, not because she sought it, but because it was impossible to ignore. She spoke with fire but also with clarity, balancing passion with reason in a way that made even her opponents pause. Communities saw her as one of their own, not a politician climbing ladders but a neighbor fighting alongside them. Authenticity became her currency. She didn't need to invent a persona or rely on focus-grouped soundbites. Her story was her argument. Her presence was proof that the system's walls could be breached. Of course, her rise was not without resistance. She faced constant skepticism, whispers that she was too young, too radical, too inexperienced. She endured headlines that dissected her wardrobe rather than her policies, pundits who dismissed her intelligence while stealing her talking points. But each attempt to sideline her only reinforced what she already knew: that dignity comes not from avoiding the fight, but from stepping into it, no matter the odds. Her resilience became legend in activist circles. When she was outnumbered, she didn't retreat. She sharpened her arguments. When she was outfunded, she built coalitions from scratch. When she was underestimated, she turned doubt into fuel. Time and again, Jasmine Crockett transformed barriers into stepping stones. This authenticity, this refusal to bend, became her greatest strength. People didn't just listen to her, they believed her. They believed her because she wasn't performing. She was living the fight she described. And in an era when politics so often feels like theater, Crockett's raw honesty was revolutionary. All of this, her upbringing, her activism, her immigrant-inclusive vision, armed her for the confrontation that awaited in that chamber with Brett Kavanaugh. Where he carried privilege like armor, she carried truth like a blade. Where he leaned on pedigree, she leaned on lived experience. Where he assumed laughter could silence, she knew dignity could break walls. Her life had been a preparation for moments like this. Every courtroom where she defended the voiceless, every headline that doubted her, every attempt to push her back into silence had sharpened her resolve. So when Brett Kavanaugh laughed, dismissing her as though she were unworthy of standing in the same space, Jasmine did not flinch. She had spent her life staring down men who underestimated her, and what came next would not simply be a clapback. It would be the culmination of a lifetime of resilience, a moment when authenticity would slice through arrogance, when dignity would stand taller than privilege. The laugh may have echoed through the chamber, but Jasmine Crockett was about to ensure that her words would echo far longer. The chamber grew heavier with every exchange. Brett Kavanaugh, seated high and confident, leaned into his role as the seasoned figure in control. His tone dripped with condescension, every question sharpened not to seek truth, but to diminish Jasmine Crockett's credibility. He didn't need to shout. His pauses, his smirks, and the way he rolled her name on his tongue carried the same intent: belittlement. "Congresswoman," he said, drawing the word out as if it were an indulgence, "do you even understand the precedent you're citing? Because from where I sit, it seems a bit oversimplified." The chamber shifted. Some of his allies exchanged smirks, already savoring what they believed was his intellectual upper hand. To them, this was routine, a man of stature reducing a younger woman to size with the ease of a seasoned cross-examiner. Cameras tilted closer. The click of shutters punctuated the silence. But Crockett didn't bite. She let his words hang in the air, unflinching, her eyes locked directly on him. The pause unnerved more than any instant rebuttal could. She sat, still, calm, as though she knew something the room didn't, as though she was waiting for him to keep digging. Kavanaugh took the bait. His voice grew more pointed, the rhythm more aggressive. "You keep invoking justice, fairness, and dignity, as if those are legal standards. They're sentiments, Congresswoman, not law. This isn't about your speeches at rallies. It's about constitutional interpretation. Perhaps if you—" That was when Crockett's lips curved into the faintest smile. It wasn't a grin for the cameras, nor was it an outburst. It was the smile of someone who had seen this play 1,000 times before. She had walked into hostile courtrooms where her clients were dismissed before they even spoke. She had stared down prosecutors who thought credentials outweighed truth. Kavanaugh's performance was not new to her. It was a well-worn script, and she knew how it ended. "Justice and dignity," she began softly, her voice measured, "are not abstract ideals, Judge. They are the foundation of law. Strip them away, and what's left isn't interpretation. It's manipulation." Her words sliced through the chamber, precise and steady. Unlike his escalating cadence, hers was controlled, deliberate. And that difference unsettled him. Kavanaugh leaned back, his mock laughter returning. "Manipulation? Congresswoman, are you accusing the court of—" But Crockett raised her hand slightly, not to silence him but to reclaim the rhythm. She refused to let his interruptions dictate the terms. "What I'm accusing," she said firmly, "is a culture of arrogance that confuses privilege with wisdom." A murmur ran through the gallery. Senators who had been leaning casually forward now sat straighter. Reporters shifted pens to paper faster. This wasn't just another hearing exchange. It was a duel, and every syllable landed like a strike. Kavanaugh tried again, his words pressing harder now. So, by your definition, any decision you disagree with is arrogance. That's a convenient standard. His smirk returned, but there was a flicker, the briefest hesitation, as if he realized he had already overplayed the laughter, already exposed the contempt too openly. Crockett didn't flinch. Not any decision. Only the ones where the people most affected are silenced, mocked, or dismissed. When law forgets humanity, Judge, it ceases to be law. Her calm tone contrasted sharply with his rising energy. It was as though he was swinging harder with every strike while she simply stepped aside, letting him lose balance. The duel wasn't about volume. It was about control, and Crockett had quietly claimed it. The chamber's atmosphere thickened. Every pair of eyes was locked on the two figures at the center. The senators leaned closer. The audience in the gallery hardly dared to shift in their seats. The cameras zoomed in tighter, lenses glinting under the lights. This wasn't a hearing anymore. It was theater, battle, history. Kavanaugh pushed once more, sharper now, as if forcing the issue could regain control. Congresswoman, with all due respect, you're turning this into a lecture. Perhaps you should remember your role here. And Crockett's reply came swift, like the crack of a whip. My role is to ensure that voices like mine are never dismissed again, especially not by men who mistake laughter for strength. The words froze the room. Even those who had sided with Kavanaugh moments before felt the weight of the declaration. The duel had turned. His laugh, his smirk, his arrogance, all of it had been weaponized against him. The chamber exhaled as though it had been holding its breath. But the tension did not dissipate. It thickened. Everyone sensed it. This was no longer just a clash of words. This was the beginning of something far larger, something that would echo far beyond the walls of that chamber. And as the cameras captured every second, the duel was only just beginning. The chamber was already tense, but what came next transformed tension into electricity. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her composure unshaken, her voice steady as though she had been waiting for this exact moment. For too long, Brett Kavanaugh's smirks, his patronizing laughter, and his polished air of superiority had hung over the room like thick smoke. But now Crockett struck the match. Judge Kavanaugh, she began, her tone calm yet razor-edged. You've spent your career confusing condescension with clarity. But here's the truth. The law isn't a playground for privilege. It is a shield for the vulnerable. And every time you laugh at that truth, you betray it. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The words landed like stones in still water, each one sending out shockwaves that made even the senators shift in their seats. Kavanaugh straightened in his chair, trying to muster that trademark composure, but his jaw tightened. Congresswoman, with all due respect, but Crockett cut him off with the precision of a surgeon. Respect is earned, Judge, and you, of all people, should know what happens when respect is lost. The chamber erupted, some with muffled laughter, others with audible murmurs of astonishment. The weight of her words wasn't just in the sound. It was in the history they carried. Everyone in the room remembered the controversies, the hearings, the accusations that had once threatened to derail his ascent. Crockett didn't need to name them. Her silence between words did the work. She continued, her voice gathering force. You sit there as if questioning my credibility erases the credibility of the people I represent. But let me remind you, my voice comes from the streets you've never walked, the communities you've never fought for, the families who don't have the luxury of laughter in the face of injustice. The camera zoomed closer. Crockett's eyes locked on his, unwavering. For the first time, Kavanaugh broke eye contact, glancing briefly down at his notes before forcing himself to look back up. The shift was subtle, but the audience saw it. And so did she. You've ruled from a place of privilege, Crockett pressed on, each sentence deliberate. But privilege is not wisdom. Power is not truth. And arrogance, she paused, letting the word hang, is not justice. The pause was deafening. The chamber seemed to hold its breath, as though every microphone and every pen had frozen to capture what might come next. Kavanaugh's lips twitched, his smirk faltering. He leaned forward, his voice sharper now. Congresswoman, these insinuations. But Crockett leaned in too, her voice lower, firmer, slicing through his interruption. These are not insinuations. These are realities. And if you're uncomfortable, that says more about you than it does about me. The room gasped again. One senator in the back raised an eyebrow. Another shook her head in disbelief. Even the stenographer's keys faltered for a moment, before resuming their steady click. Crockett didn't stop there. Her words began to build rhythm, rising like a drumbeat. You see, Judge, men like you believe the chamber belongs to you, that these seats, these titles, these robes are shields against accountability. But I stand here as proof that you can't laugh away the truth. Not anymore. The gallery stirred. Applause threatened but was restrained by decorum. Yet the energy was unmistakable. Crockett was no longer just answering questions. She was dismantling an institution of arrogance piece by piece, and the entire room knew it. Kavanaugh shifted again, this time visibly uncomfortable. His hand tapped his pen against the desk, betraying nerves he tried to hide. He opened his mouth, then closed it, struggling to find footing in the duel he thought he controlled. Crockett seized the moment. You mock justice because you've never had to beg for it. You laugh at dignity because yours was never denied. You diminish my words because you think the weight of your title outweighs the weight of truth. But I've built my entire career proving men like you wrong, and today is no different. The audience's murmur swelled again, and even some senators on Kavanaugh's side glanced at him with unease. His confidence had cracked and everyone could see it. Crockett pressed harder, her tone now carrying both authority and moral fire. Every time you dismiss questions of fairness, every time you scoff at the fight for equality, you reveal what you fear most: accountability. You fear the moment when someone looks past the robe, past the title, and sees the man beneath, a man who hides behind procedure to avoid facing principle. Kavanaugh's face flushed slightly. His laughter, once his weapon was gone, the smirk had faded into a tight-lipped silence. He shifted in his seat, the weight of the cameras bearing down on him. Crockett let the silence hang before delivering the final blow. You asked if I understand the law, Judge. I do. What I also understand is this: the law was written for the people, not for the powerful. And when you laugh at me, you laugh at them. But here's the difference between us. I will never laugh at the people I serve. I will fight for them until my last breath. The chamber exploded in murmurs, a collective gasp rolling through like a wave. Kavanaugh, rattled, gripped his pen tighter, his knuckles white. He looked less like the composed judge and more like a man cornered, exposed. For the first time in that chamber, the balance of power had shifted entirely. The hero had ascended, not with volume, not with spectacle, but with dignity sharpened into a blade. And the villain had been struck, not fatally, but unmistakably. The silence that followed was heavier than the words themselves. Every ear strained, every heart pounded, waiting for what might come next. And in that stillness, one truth was undeniable. Brett Kavanaugh's laughter had been silenced, and Jasmine Crockett's voice now carried the room. But the story didn't end there. Because as the world outside would soon prove, this clash was only the spark, and the fire it lit was about to roar far beyond the chamber walls. The chamber may have fallen into silence after Jasmine Crockett's mic drop, but the world outside was anything but quiet. Within minutes, phones lit up across the country as clips of her takedown began flooding social media feeds. By the time Crockett had even left the chamber, the hashtags were already roaring to life. Crockett clapped back, Kavanaugh speechless. Justice served, each one raced up Twitter's trending board like rockets. TikTok filled with split-screen reactions, young women gasping, immigrants nodding with pride, law students replaying her words frame by frame like analysts dissecting a legendary play. Memes mushroomed instantly. Kavanaugh's frozen face, wide-eyed and rattled, became the centerpiece of countless captions. One read, "When you laugh at the wrong person." Another simply added flames around Crockett with the tagline, "Queen of the Senate." Late-night comedians pounced almost as soon as their writers' rooms opened. One joked, Kavanaugh went in laughing, and came out Googling, "Can judges resign quietly?" The audience roared. Another said, "That wasn't a clapback. That was a constitutional amendment." Clips from these monologues themselves went viral. feeding the cycle of Crockett's rising stardom and Kavanaugh's faltering aura. But it wasn't just entertainment. Serious commentators joined in, their voices layered with awe. A respected constitutional scholar on MSNBC said, "What Crockett did was redefine the courtroom dynamic." She reminded the nation that dignity can overpower pedigree. On CNN, another analyst warned, Kavanaugh underestimated her, and in doing so, exposed himself more than he ever intended. Across living rooms and cafes, voters weighed in. For supporters of Crockett, this was vindication, a long-awaited moment where someone stood tall against condescension and won. For critics, even they couldn't deny the sharpness of her words. One conservative columnist admitted reluctantly, she hit him where it hurt, his credibility. And he never saw it coming. Everywhere the refrain was the same. Kavanaugh had miscalculated. His laugh, meant to belittle, became the soundtrack of his own undoing. For days, headlines refused to let the story fade. Crockett silences Kavanaugh in stunning exchange. The laugh that backfired. Congresswoman's clapback echoes nationwide. On YouTube, compilations of the clash hit millions of views in hours. The comment sections overflowing with praise. "This woman gave me goosebumps," wrote one viewer. "I showed this to my teenage daughter. She said she's never felt prouder," wrote another. Meanwhile, Kavanaugh himself avoided the spotlight, but whispers in Washington were deafening. Allies muttered about his visible discomfort, the way his smirk dissolved in real time. Staffers reportedly urged him not to respond, fearing that any defense would only reignite the firestorm. One insider summed it up bluntly. He never saw it coming, and now he doesn't know how to recover. Crockett, however, didn't rush to capitalize. She carried herself with the same calm she had shown in the chamber, offering only a brief remark to reporters. "It wasn't about me. It was about reminding all of us who justice is supposed to serve." That humility only deepened the public's admiration. The shockwaves rippled further than commentary. Grassroots organizations seized on the moment, weaving her words into fundraising emails, campaign posters, even chants at rallies. College students painted murals of Crockett, larger than life, staring down a caricatured Kavanaugh. In immigrant neighborhoods, her speech was translated into Spanish, Urdu, and Mandarin, circulating as proof that representation was not just symbolic, but transformative. International media picked it up too. The BBC ran a headline, "American Congresswoman Humiliates Supreme Court Justice." In India, one outlet called her speech a masterclass in holding power to account. Across the globe, people marveled at a story that transcended politics, a tale of truth outlasting arrogance. And as the dust settled, one truth became unshakable. Kavanaugh's laugh, once a signal of superiority, would forever be remembered as the spark that ignited his own embarrassment. Crockett had turned the tables so decisively that even those who once dismissed her now whispered her name with respect. The aftermath was not just shock, it was transformation. Crockett had claimed her place in the narrative of justice, not through title or privilege, but through courage sharpened into words. But as the country basked in the glow of her triumph, a question lingered like smoke after a blaze. Was this merely a viral moment, or the dawn of a new chapter in American politics? Because one thing was certain, the clash may have ended, but the ripple effects were only beginning. When Jasmine Crockett finally stepped away from the hearing chamber, she carried with her more than the weight of a single exchange. She carried a lesson, one that reached beyond the clash of personalities and struck at the very heart of what justice is supposed to mean in America. Because Crockett knew that this was never just about Brett Kavanaugh. It was never just about his laugh, his condescension, or his fragile sense of superiority. It was about something far larger, a test of whether dignity could withstand the full force of arrogance. In her closing reflections, she did not claim victory for herself. Instead, she widened the lens. What happened in that chamber, she told reporters, wasn't about me versus him. It was about whether truth still matters in a world built to excuse privilege. It was about whether people who've been dismissed their whole lives finally get to stand tall and be heard. Her words resonated because they distilled a universal truth. Power can be inherited, appointed or handed down, but respect must be earned. And when arrogance collides with authenticity, it is authenticity that endures. For countless Americans watching, Crockett's composure was more than political theater. It was validation. Women saw in her a refusal to be minimized. Immigrants and children of immigrants saw in her the proof that resilience can bend even the coldest halls of power. Young people, often told to wait their turn, saw in her an answer. Sometimes you don't wait, sometimes you rise. This wasn't a story of a laugh silenced. It was a story of a legacy being written. Because Crockett's calm, razor-sharp takedown wasn't just a response to one man's arrogance. It was a declaration that dignity, when wielded with courage, becomes a weapon no sneer can withstand. And that is why her moment echoed beyond the chamber, beyond headlines, beyond trending hashtags. It reminded America and the world that justice is not preserved by those who sit smugly in power, but by those who refuse to be silenced in the face of it. In the days that followed, Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't dance on Kavanaugh's misstep. Instead, she embodied the very message she carried. Humility is strength, and strength, when rooted in truth, cannot be shaken. It became clear that this was not merely a viral confrontation. It was a parable for a generation, one that said, "You may not have privilege, you may not have connections, but if you carry yourself with authenticity and refuse to bow, you carry something more powerful than either, the ability to shift the narrative, because privilege fades. Arrogance crumbles. But dignity? Dignity lasts. And so Crockett's exchange will be remembered not as a clash of titles, but as a clash of values, and a victory for those who believe justice must serve the many, not the few. As one commentator put it, this wasn't about Crockett showing she was equal to power. It was about her showing that truth, at its core, is greater than power. Her words, her poise, her unshakable sense of self, these became more than political tools. They became a mirror for millions who had been told they were less. And in that reflection, people found hope. By the time the noise faded, one thing remained undeniable. Crockett had proven that history doesn't always remember the loudest laugh. More often, it remembers the quiet strength of those who stood firm when it mattered most. And as she walked out of that chamber, the lesson was unmistakable. This was bigger than her, bigger than him, bigger than one clash in Washington. It was a reminder that truth, justice, and resilience will always outlast arrogance and privilege. And in that reminder, a nation found its hope. Brett Kavanaugh laughed. Jasmine Crockett answered. And in that instant, the balance of the chamber shifted. What began as mockery ended as revelation. A reminder that arrogance can be silenced, and truth can still command the room. That moment is why you're here. It's why millions couldn't look away. Because Crockett's words weren't just a clapback. They were a spark that says power isn't defined by who laughs the loudest, but by who stands tallest when it matters most. And here's the truth. If her voice shook the Senate, imagine what our voices together can do. Imagine the change when millions refuse to be dismissed, when millions echo the courage of a single woman who refused to bow. That is bigger than politics. That is the power of dignity turned into movement. So don't let this moment pass as just another viral clip. Carry it forward. Share it with someone who needs reminding that truth is louder than privilege. Subscribe so you don't miss the stories that prove resilience can still win in a cynical world. And add your voice. In the comments, in your communities, in every place, arrogance still tries to silence authenticity. Because this isn't just Crockett's story. It's our story. A story of what happens when laughter meant to belittle is swallowed by dignity that cannot be denied. A story that says no chamber, no title, no laugh can erase the truth. And if tonight you feel even a fraction of that spark, then join us. Subscribe, share, speak up. Together we turn sparks into fire, and fire into change. Because in the end, history doesn't remember the laugh. It remembers the moment dignity answered back.